Yeah, I think we can start. Welcome everybody, and especially welcome to Bonnie Evans. Bonnie Evans is a historian and a senior research fellow at the Queen Mary University of London, and she has researched and published a number of papers on the history of autism, or the autism diagnosis, and on the international history of child sciences, psychology, and eugenics. And she has also written and talked about this topic in public media, and she has, of course, written this book with the title The Metamorphosis of Autism. And this is the background for this event today. The title is What Was Autism and What Can It Be in the Future? But before I leave the floor to Bonnie Evans, a few words on the background for this event. I'm Jon Kyllingstad, and I'm working at something called the Museum for University History at the University of Oslo. And we have a project, a research project on the history of psychological testing. And as you may learn more about today, the history of autism has a lot to do with also with the history of psychometric testing. So this is the background why we have invited Bonnie Evans here, and we invited all of you to this event. And I just inform you about, we have this exhibition at the University of Oslo about psychometric testing. I put some postcards at the desk at the entrance, so if you want to see our exhibition, please take a postcard, you'll find information about it. And we are also doing this event in collaboration with something called the Science Studies Colloquium at the University of Oslo, Forum for Vitenskapshistorie. And on Wednesday, the 24th of May at 2 p.m., Bonnie Evans will give another lecture at the Blindern campus, which you are all welcome to join. The title is Universal Psychology and the Rights of the Child, the Influence of the 1957 International Conference on Psychiatry. And you will find information about this as well on the desk at the entrance. So the program for tonight is quite simple. First, Bonnie will give a 40 minutes talk, and then we will sit down here and we will open for questions and comments from all of you. So then I'll leave the floor to Bonnie Evans. Welcome.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? I've got on this little mic here. So firstly, I'd like to thank everybody who organised this event today. I know quite a lot of people have been involved, and it's really great to see all of you here this evening. I do think that it's very important that we have these public discussions, not just about autism, but psychology in general. So I'm really pleased that you're out here today to be part of this, and I'm really looking forward to your questions at the end as well. So in my talk, I'm going to be focusing on mainly the history of the autism category. It's going to be quite a broad sweep of history, so I'll be covering lots of things, so if there's anything that you want me to go into more detail at the end, please just ask. And I'm going to talk about what I've referred to in some of my writing as the Autism Paradox. And my argument today is really that in order to think constructively and think differently about autism in the future, it's important to sort of understand how we've reached this paradox now. So I wrote an article about this in Aeon Magazine, the Autism Paradox, and I describe this as essentially it's the historical process whereby autism came to be regarded not just as a clinical label and a diagnosis, but also as an important aspect of identity and something that was important to many people. So this talk will look at sort of what history can teach us about how and why autism in particular has led us to this paradox. And I'll argue that this is part of a bigger paradox, actually, within psychology and within psychological thinking, and autism sits at the heart of this. And what I'll be talking about today, it also draws from some of the arguments that I made in my book that John referenced, The Metamorphosis of Autism. That book looked in particular at a sort of radical transformation in the meaning of autism that takes place in the 1960s and 1970s. So I'll be talking a bit about that as well. So, as you may be aware, there has been a large increase in the diagnosis of autism in the last 20 to 25 years. The records start showing changes in the 1960s, but then more recently the growth is more obvious. So from the late 90s in the UK, in the USA, Japan, you begin to see big rises. It happens later in some other European countries and elsewhere. This is a graph from the USA Center for Disease Control, and it's based on data from different sites across the USA, so it's pretty good measurement. And in the USA, rates go up from 6 per 1,000 children in 2000 to 23 per 1,000 children in 2018. This can be translated as around 1 in 44 children with autism age 8. So this is a sort of advert from the Center for Disease Control. As you can see here, they're saying learn the signs, act early. And actually around 80% of those children diagnosed in this study are boys. So you'll see there are very similar rates and similar increases in the UK. This is a UK graph by Ginny Russell. It's a different measurement, but you can see again the trend is up. In Norway, there was a study by Kamil Uzerk, if I've pronounced that right, a professor of pedagogy at the University of Oslo, and he reported a rate of 1 in 166 children. So that's below the USA, but again, he reports quite rapid increases recently. Since 2012 in particular, there's been increases here. And we are also seeing these increases internationally now. And the World Health Organization have now responded to these increases by issuing general training in how to manage autism. Of course, this also requires an international agreement on what autism is. Now, we know that changing rates of autism have been affected by changing diagnostic criteria. This was the renowned scientist, she's a veterinary scientist and autism advocate who you may know, Temple Grandin, explaining this on USA Today. But this phrase, changing diagnostic criteria, it gets repeated very often without there being sort of more explanation as to why diagnostic criteria change so much. And also, you know, there is a question around, is there a tipping point with these increases, or will they just keep going up? In the UK and the USA, we recently see more increases in diagnosis in girls and women. And this was actually just as I was putting this presentation together, this headline came up on the BBC News, which is the highest global rate of autism that's ever been reported in Northern Ireland, which is 1 in every 20 children diagnosed with autism. That's breaking news. So it does make you wonder sort of how many people will this diagnosis encompass at the end, or what is happening here? So in order to understand this in more depth, I've argued, and I'll continue to argue, that we need to go back to the beginning to the beginnings of psychology. And you may wonder, how is that going to help with these contemporary questions? Well, apart from the fact that the trajectory of increased cases maps the sort of historical process, it happens over time. The value of looking at history is also, we've seen situations similar to this before. We've seen psychological diagnoses rise and fall. For example, hysteria was a very popular diagnosis in mid to late 19th century, promoted by neurologists such as Jean-Martin Charcot, pictured here. It went through a large increase, it eventually dies out. But what's interesting is that these increases are driven often by other factors, and many have argued that hysteria was related to sort of changing patriarchal beliefs about how women should behave and perform. That's why this diagnosis rises at this time in the 19th century. And often these trends are also gendered. One thing I did want to point out is that as a historian, my interest isn't sort of in whether or not a diagnosis is real in any clinical sense, but what I am interested in is why certain resources get directed towards particular concepts at particular times. And what we're seeing now is that there is a lot of attention being placed on the autism diagnosis. So if we do go back to the beginning, if anyone tells me that the history of autism can be traced back to Leo Kanner, I'm going to get annoyed. The concept can be traced back to Eugen Bleuler, who is a Swiss psychiatrist working in the early 20th century. And he's writing in German. This is Bleuler's description of autistic thinking in 1911. He says, it's a kind of thinking that takes place in symbols, in analogies, in fragmentary concepts, in accidental connections. And the concept actually arises from a debate between Bleuler and Sigmund Freud. You've probably heard of him. And to paraphrase, that discussion went something like, Bleuler said, Freud, I'm trying to find a concept that captures the very origins of all thought. And Freud says, okay, I have a term for that. I call it autoerotism. In the Freudian model, you know, the idea of self-love is the rough translation of that. And Bleuler says, well, Freud, we know that you're always talking about love and sex. I don't want that part in it. I'll take out the erot and I'll call it autism. I looked at all the correspondence sort of surrounding the beginnings of the term. The only qualification I would say to that is that all psychologists at this time, in the early 20th century, they're all trying to find a word for the origins of all thought. There's autophilia, egocentricity. This debate sparks Freud's work on primary narcissism, so everybody's talking about this. It's the sort of hot topic. And that was what autism was at the beginning. But because of this, you know, the autism concept, it's really a fundamental concept in all of psychology, in all of psychological thinking. And it's worth sort of remembering that when we're thinking about what's happening with these historical trends. The developmental psychologist Jean Piaget writes a lot about autism in the 1920s. This is Piaget's description of autism in 1922. He says there's an absence of logic in autism, but a predominance of visual imagery and visual thinking. And early descriptions of autism, they actually really highlight the creative aspects and the fact that it is a kind of thinking that's filled with images, visual thinking. And all of these descriptions of autism, they precede Kanner's paper. And Kanner's understanding of autism is actually not that different from Jean Piaget and Bleuler. He just says it can be used as a diagnosis. But when he writes, it's actually very similar to what these other arguments are. He's saying very similar things to Bleuler and Piaget. So going back to the origins of psychology then, it's in the 10s and 20s that modern psychology is formed, to the extent that this is when the mind of the child is studied in detail. So we see the origins of intelligence testing, the establishment of developmental schedules. Here's a picture of Arnold Gesell, the US psychologist at Yale, who put these little babies in a glass dome and studied thousands of children, looking at the ages that children would sort of typically pick up an object, typically make eye contact, typically say their first words, typically do all of these things. Here are some of Gesell's images of a typical infant aged between 5 to 6 months and their typical responses to being handed these objects. And as an observational method, developmental scales were always only ever about studying statistical norms across a population, what usually happens across any population of children. And that supported the development of intelligence testing. And at the same time, however, that we see these models of autism being established in psychology, the development of IQ tests and typical sort of models in psychological understanding, we also see the growing implementation of eugenic policies. This is one institution in New York State where children who didn't fit developmental norms were sent. And actually what happens, not just in the USA, in the UK and across Europe, as educational rights are extended and as education becomes compulsory, more children are being sent to institutions such as these because they don't match sort of widespread societal educational expectations about what they should be doing within early statistical psychology. This is a similar institution in the UK, established in 1919, and this is a photo from inside Meanwood Park, that institution. One thing that we do know about eugenics, the UK, USA, and across Europe is that many psychologists are collaborating with medical officers identifying people to be sent to these institutions. But the other thing to remember is that the local context made a huge difference. So in the records that I've looked at in the UK, it made a huge difference whether you were living in London, whether you were living in Leeds, as to which institution you were sent, whether or not you would have been identified, which school you would have gone to. But we also know that these institutions were, significant and important places where many children were sent. And in the USA, there were similarities. In the USA, we know sterilization laws were passed there too, which made the sort of situation in institutions even more difficult and complex. And the work of Niels Storell Hansen, actually, at the University of Oslo, has looked at sterilization laws in Scandinavia. We know that some people who were admitted to these institutions were sterilized. But in general, in the UK, for example, in institutions like these, children and young people would be given things like occupational therapy. Young people were kept occupied and having to adopt, the social role that they were given here. Of course, we also know in Nazi Germany, through the work of Edith Schäfer, who's looked at Asperger's and his role in sending children to the T4 programs of euthanasia in Nazi Germany. We know that this also occurred. Her work's been important in sort of demonstrating that. So just to sort of keep that in mind in terms of as we lead on to the next part of the talk, what I've argued with regards to developmental psychology generally is that the rise of eugenic policies, what the rise of those policies did was to sort of stunt the understanding of child development across total populations. So there was a large group of children who no one was studying at this time. So at the same time as you have the birth of psychological thinking, you have the birth of psychological understanding, you also have segregation, which means that that understanding is also being kind of flawed at the same time as it's being developed. So on the one hand, you saw from the early 20th century the development of sort of tailored psychotherapy, specialized descriptions of early development, specialized study of language to support individuals. Then on the other side, you have intelligence testing, people focusing on identifying people with low IQ, looking at norms, looking for outliers, focusing on behavior, and they weren't really interested in studying sort of social dynamics and social relations at all. So that had important impact on the autism category, this word meaning the origins of all thought, because within psychoanalysis it became sort of quite a reified concept in psychoanalytic theory as part of descriptions on how the self was formed. But on the other hand, IQ testers just weren't really interested, and they were just looking at sort of norms. They weren't interested in this sort of depth study of the self at that time. But so this all changed after the war. So after the war, the realization of the sort of true horror of Nazi ideologies and policies led to a sort of reset in how governments managed populations and a rethinking of the entire theory of eugenics, really, and the logic of which had its pinnacle in the Nazi T4 program. So after the destruction of the war, it was clear that some sort of radical rethinking needed to take place within psychology. And what happened then is that after the war, the World Health Organization, they issue a statement saying essentially that enforced institutional care has to stop. It just all has to stop. There's no medical justification for it. There's no excuse or reasoning that governments can give anymore for it to continue. They say this in 1953, and governments, they say you need to wind down these policies. So that doesn't happen overnight. This is a photo from a 1957 book by two medical doctors in the UK when these institutions were still running, and they're making the argument that these institutions now are completely crowded, that segregating children based on intelligence tests was hugely problematic. They support what the World Health Organization is saying. Meanwhile, the older professional psychologists who still sort of had their blinkers on with regard to populations of children who'd just been placed in institutional care, they continue to write about autism, and they do clinical work with autism. On the left is John Bowlby, who was famous for his maternal deprivation theory of autism. And on the right-hand side, this is Bruno Bettelham, who was working in the 1950s in the USA, and he was known for developing what he called the refrigerator mother theory of autism, which Kanner supported actually in the 1950s. He made this argument as well. But the point is that these men who are putting forward these theories at this time, they were using a concept that wasn't fit for purpose, because they were looking at a concept that had ultimately derived from the study of adults that wasn't related to the study of childhood and developmental norms. Because of this division between sort of psychoanalysis and intelligence testing, it was a very limited, concept that they were using. But they did gain a lot of coverage at the time. This is a clip from John Bowlby's film on maternal deprivation that was made in the UK. But so much sort of simplification took place at that moment. And the autism concept was already so sort of limited, it becomes even more simplified in these models. These discussions of maternal deprivation only become even more bizarre as time goes on. This shows the work of Harry Harlow, who was influenced by John Bowlby, and he thought he could understand the effects of love by separating infant monkeys from their mothers to see if they wanted to get warmth from a spiky doll or from a soft doll. And, you know, these poor monkeys obviously became very distressed, but he was just trying to demonstrate that children needed love, which was something which, you know, perhaps they could have assumed. Anyway, thankfully, there were some researchers who could see the sort of strange things that were happening in psychology at this time. You know, the strange direction that the study of autism and human relationships was taking after the war. They understood that the segregation of large sections of the population had led many to adopt quite a bizarre version of society and human relations. And they argued that maybe it made sense that instead of having a divided psychology, dividing, you know, psychoanalysis and psychotherapy and then IQ testing, it made sense to bring these measures together. And this moment is actually the birth of our current models of autism. It's not with Kanner. It's this moment when statistical psychologists begin to study social development and relationships and internal models of the mind. And that doesn't happen until the 1960s. So what many people don't fully appreciate actually is sort of enthusiasm that new autism research was conducted with from the 1960s. You know, many people viewed it as incredibly progressive. It was a way to move past the cruel eugenicist philosophies of the early period, and people wrote about this. They said that it was a way to challenge the attack on mothers that had occurred after the war. And so the rise of autism sort of went hand in hand then with this passion for accurate social scientific measurement and progressive change. Many mothers actually set up their own schools in the 1960s, and they had to create a whole new paradigm or way of thinking about human development and sort of refashion these broken sciences from before. In the mid-1960s, the British psychiatrist John Wing, who is the husband of Lorna Wing, he supervises the first ever epidemiological study of autism anywhere in the world. So now we are familiar with people going out and counting how many children there are with autism, as I showed at the slides at the start. But at that time, that was not the case. And the Wing and Lotus study was the first study that had ever done this. They went out in London and they started counting all the children with autism. And on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the list of autistic behaviors that were, well, at this time, schizophrenic syndrome is almost it's identical to autism in these studies. And these were the 9 points that they identified as characteristic of autism. But, you know, the first attempt to measure autism hit some very big obstacles from the start because no one had any way of measuring or defining autism across a group of people, but of course you can't count autism unless you can measure it. These were the behavioral definitions that were used in Lotus study. Sorry, I don't know if you can, they haven't come out very clearly on that slide. But one of the things that there was a lot of discussion about was this second point, apparent unawareness of his own personal identity, because there was a big discussion over whether or not it was possible to rate this using behavioral measures. Lotta thought that he could do that, and all these behavioral measures here, things like jumping, flapping, toe walking, solitary, aloof, carrying, banging, twirling objects, insistence on sameness. He said we have to have a list of behaviors, so otherwise how do we know? How do we know who's autistic and who isn't? If we come back, then what's also happening in education and institutional care at this time, by the 70s, all the large institutional, large deficiency institutions have been closed down. They were beginning to be closed down. In Britain, it was the Education Act in 1970 that put forward the proposition that every child had a right to education, every child. And I often read histories about the history of education that say education became compulsory in the late 19th century, but it didn't. It doesn't actually become compulsory for everybody. All children don't receive the right to education in the UK until 1970. And in the USA, there's a similar act in 1975 that sort of enables these changes to take place. And when all children do begin to enter the education system in the 70s and 80s, there was, of course, a distinct lack of understanding and expertise around what to do with these children. There was suddenly a huge demand for autism expertise. So all of the mothers who'd set up these schools, all of the psychologists who were doing these studies suddenly were sort of called to attention. There was the need for any expertise on how to support relationships, emotional life for individuals who up until then had not really been in the education system, who weren't even recognized as social subjects, essentially. And it's also in this historical context with these massive changes in the services that the autism concept becomes even more defined. I know that all of you are coming from very different backgrounds. I don't know how many of you know the triad of impairments of autism that was put forward in 1979 by Lorna Wing and Judith Gould. They drew from the statistical studies that were being conducted in the UK at the time, and they argued that within all of these behaviors, you could see this triad of impairments: social communication, social imagination, and social interaction that they said they identified in autism. Now, many people have since then criticized this model of autism, but it is also important to recognize, I guess, that at that historical moment, that diagnosis did function as a way to support parents who were sort of struggling to get suitable education for their children, because it could be used in its simplest terms. Parents and educators could use the theory of social impairment to say, well, this child needs social support. From this, we see the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical model of autism from the 80s, and this, the ADI and the ADOS. Again, I don't know how familiar everybody is with these diagnostic models here, but I know that they've spread in many countries in the USA and across Europe. It became, the ADI and the ADOS became the sort of, they were regarded as the sort of pièce de résistance of the autism diagnostic modeling. And what was actually radical about ADI and ADOS at the time was that they were employing quite radical observation techniques. So Rutter worked with many sociologists, actually, and many sociologists who were trying to sort of really hone and understand and give a snapshot of society at any given point of time. And the role of the ADI was to get this kind of representation of reality. They said, we encourage an interaction that appears natural, during which pre-planned occasions for certain behaviors arise. And the schedule covers sort of social intentionality, imaginative play, pretend play, compulsion, rituals, food fads, tics, gait, movement. It covers sort of every single aspect of development. And Rutter's goal was to sort of make this available to as many people as possible, to as many countries and cultures as possible. So as we move through the 80s, we do see other external factors moving on from the shift in institutional care, the rise of neoliberal strategies, the collapse of communist regimes, Reagan and Thatcher built their reputations in the UK and the USA on cutting social spending budgets, encouraging neoliberal forms of investment. And what's significant here is that, by encouraging these market models, Thatcher and Reagan also created in the UK and the USA a kind of market for welfare products. So in order to access those welfare products, somebody couldn't say, I need help. They had to say why they needed help, what were the behaviors that were displayed that meant that they need help. And the triad of impairments model in these countries does, map that change. And the other thing that's important to remember about sort of diagnostic tools in the 80s and 90s, that they were really focused on sort of proving that autism could be explained either via neuroscientific studies of the brain and or via these behavioral studies. And actually, at that time, there were a lot more opportunities being developed to study the brain, fMRI scans. In the 1990s, George Bush declared the 1990s the decade of the brain, encouraged policy advisors to be more informed in neuroscientific work. You see the foundation also of the Human Genome Project. And there was a huge kind of flurry of interest and lots of people wanting to find the genetic basis of autism, using these behavioral categories, using these diagnostic tools that had been developed. But nobody found this category, autism, in these places. But the dream of finding it was inspiring a lot of researchers at this time. And you also see from the 90s then, autism is increasingly described as a neurodevelopmental disorder. So it's interesting because prior to that, it's a sort of psychological description or psychological disorder, but this sort of language of neurosciences comes in from the 90s. But this was very important in kind of claiming back the diagnosis, claiming it back from post-war mother blaming. But in actual fact, it was still a sort of a behavioral-based category. They just put neuro at the start of it, became a neurodevelopmental disorder. As rates increased, more people became familiar with the language of neurodevelopmental disorder, school teachers, parents, children, everyone. And of course, everyone began to notice these behaviors as they looked around them, and they seemed to be more prevalent in boys. One thing that, you can think about is the fact that when institutional care facilities were shut down, you did have, new situations being created in classrooms, and it did happen that more boys were sort of identified with autism in this period. The findings of Fragile X and autism, there were many studies that did find an association between Fragile X and autism in some cases, in a few of the broad number of cases that were being diagnosed. But they were really blown out of proportion. So this was the sort of book that was published by Byron Cohen in the 90s, The Essential Difference, who argued at that time for the extreme male brain theory of autism, and argued that autism was just a definition of masculinity, essentially. But he was taken seriously in the early the 90s with these theories. But they were being driven by these social changes. They were being driven by these external factors, and then they're coming up within mainstream psychological modeling. But actually, by 2010, a lot of the sort of fervor around finding the neuroscientific correlates or a genetic basis for autism began to die down. This is Catherine Lord's description of autism in 2010. Autism is the most commonly studied of a spectrum of developmental disorders that are believed to be neurobiologically based, but which at this point, for lack of good biomarkers, are defined purely by behavior. So she wasn't making any big claims, and you begin to see this happening now from the 2010s a lot more. And to have a psychological state that is defined purely by behavior is unique. That is the paradox of autism. It's both a psychological state in an individual, and it's also a collection of behaviors that are applied across a population. And it can be both of these things. It can, also be extremely significant, important to an individual as well. In the 90s, in the USA and the UK, we begin to see the rise of the neurodiversity movement. I know John and I were talking about this a little bit, and what's happening in Norway. I'm really interested if anybody knows more about that here. Neurodiversity advocates began to take more control, essentially, of the narratives around autism, take more control of the diagnosis, because there was never an authority on this sort of central aspect of all thought. How could there be? Judy Singer, who founded the neurodiversity movement, she argued that autistic people should form their own political group. But this is a quote from Singer that I found in an interview with Samantha Kraft, which I thought was really interesting. I saw that if we were going to legitimate our movement, we needed an important sounding word in the new language of neuroscience. I have to say that neurodiversity is really just a new word for an old idea, a fancy 21st century way of repeating the old adage, from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. And obviously that sounds less cool than neurodiversity, but it was true that what Singer was doing, she knew what she was doing when she applied that neuro prefix. Everybody had been doing that. And in the face of these population studies, in the face of growing definitions of neurodevelopmental disorder, and that gave autism a new kind of narrative life, because autistic people could now describe their own experiences of thinking. They didn't need a psychologist to do that. And we've seen with the rise of social media, things like the Actually Autistics hashtag on Twitter, only to be used by autistic people. This was obviously a way to create a sort of shared network, shared community, shared understandings away from professional groups who were saying this is what autism is. And via social media, autistic advocates have also generated a significant political power. Some of you may know about the Spectrum 10K study, which was a study that was proposed by Byron Cohen, but there was a huge resistance to that. And these are the protests that happened in person, people with signs like, take your hands off our DNA. There were fears around how the study could be used for eugenic purposes, and there was a lot of kind of, interest in what was going on in these scientific studies, and it sort of stalled the development of those plans. Another important debate that the neurodiversity movement has been involved in is on applied behavioral analysis, and whether or not this is a useful treatment for autism. I don't know if that's something people want to discuss in the afterwards, but the neurodiversity movement in general have been very critical of applied behavioral analysis. The one thing that I think is interesting about applied behavioral analysis is that it is about behavior. It is only about behavior, and if we look back at the history of autism and how it's been defined, again, that's an important thing to remember as in how we think about that. And within these networks, new understandings of autism have emerged. I'm going to finish very soon, but there's been sort of different stories to the scientific accounts. So, for example, Temple Grandin's was the first book that did this, that sort of put forward her own description of autistic thinking. And actually, Temple Grandin does talk a lot, interestingly, about thinking in pictures and images, which is what the original autism describes. But all of these are very recent books. Look Me in the Eye, The Reason I Jump, I Overcame My Autism, and All I Got Was Anxiety Disorder. And these narratives are really changing the scientific research now, because what psychological concept could only be defined by behavior. So just to leave with a parting, thought. Byron Cohen's actually really changed his viewpoint. This is something that I just thought was interesting that I saw recently, but he's no longer sort of using autism to advocate his gender essentialism. There's a far more kind of complicated understanding about gender, sexuality, autism that's now emerging, and that's partly in response to all these narratives that have grown up around this. But, scientists, psychologists are having to respond. And to summarize then, historically, the autism category has always been a significant category within psychological sciences since the early 20th century. After the Second World War, this category became associated with an enthusiasm or a passion for social change, for inclusion and justice. And during the 80s and 90s, as social welfare systems are dismantled, the autism diagnosis did serve as a way to sort of sheltering some people from the challenges of global capitalism. But even from its origins, its meaning has always contained paradoxes. It can explain the social development of an individual. Now it's providing different sort of understandings of social and gender development in total populations. In that sense, it's a very useful sociological tool. And the neurodiversity movement are now creating even more narratives and more data to understand this. But history teaches us that the autism paradox is really the paradox that's part of all human difference. How can you measure, classify, and quantify any aspect of human psychology without also silencing attempts to tell that story differently? And if there was one psychological concept that could teach us this, it is autism. It is autism, the concept that once described the origins of all thought. It should teach us that we have reached this point now and help us to think about what autism could be in the future.
Thanks a lot for this extremely rich presentation. Maybe we can sit down there and
Should I take my water, sir?
and we open for questions from the comments from the